Good evening. I'm Giulio Dalvit, the Assistant Curator of Sculpture at the Frick Collection in New York. Thank you for joining us once again for a new episode of Cocktails with a Curator. Tonight, I'd like to introduce you to this beautiful portrait bust of Étienne Vincent de Margnolas by the French sculptor Joseph Chinard. Chinard was born in 1756 in Lyon, in the south of France. And he's known today for his portraits of Napoleon and his family. That's really why he's best known today. And here you see a beautifully sad bust of Empress Josephine next to her husband, Napoleon. Josephine is in Cleveland today, while the Napoleon bust is in a private collection. So it is really in honor of Chinard's most important patron that tonight I decided to pair this episode with a cocktail which is called Napoleon. It's very simple. It's 4 parts of gin, 1 part of brandy-based orange liquor, and 1 part of French Dubonnet Rouge. So cheers. But before becoming the official portraitist of Napoleon's family, who was Chinard? You see him here in a very peculiar type of self-portrait statuette and in a portrait drawing by Jean-Baptiste Isabey at the Art Institute in Chicago. Chinard kind of led a very turbulent life. And I'm saying this because between 1784 and 1786, so aged between 28 and 30, he finally managed to go to Rome to study abroad. And there he was arrested and put on trial. But it wasn't the only time Chinard was arrested. It happened again, as we will see. It happened twice at least. Thanks to a wonderful research undertaken by an Italian scholar called Massimo Cattaneo, we now know basically everything about the Chinard trial in Rome and what happened. And in the trial papers, he's described as a very tall man with very dark hair and a face marked by smallpox. So it's kind of nice to integrate this description with the statuette that we are seeing and the drawing that we are seeing. Also, the trial papers tell us that Chinard was a resident of Rome and he was flat sharing in Rome with another Frenchman, an apartment close to the Spanish Steps in Rome, which was really the area, the most international area where many artists from abroad used to live. And we know that it was a neighbor who reported them. And we also know why. And I quote from the neighbor's deposition. "They have meetings with naked women with whom they dance obscenely, as the gardener will tell you. They say that it is high time," they being Chinard and his flatmate, "to kill the Pope, and after that, it will be easy to subjugate the cardinals and establish the same freedom in Rome as there is in France now. They," Chinard and his flatmates, "deny both paradise and hell. They say it's a lot of nonsense. And they eat poultry and meat when it is forbidden, and so ridicule the Catholic faith. And what's worse, they invite young men and women from Rome to join their school." But in addition to all of this, what really puzzled, in a way, the judges of the trial was the presence in Chinard's studio, as the police found out, of 2 statuettes, which were actually sketches for candelabra that Chinard was making for a rich merchant from Lyon called Van Riesenberg. And the judges were really puzzled by these statuettes, and they thought that they couldn't really grasp what was going on here and what was the iconography, but they had no doubt that their subject was heretic, because they couldn't, it couldn't match with anything they knew of. So it must be something new and absolutely contrary to the papal law. And it was, because we now know from documentary research that the first one of these two candelabra, this one that you're seeing, and they're both in the Musée Carnavalet in Paris, the first one depicted reason in the guise of Apollo defeating superstition, which obviously in Chinard's opinion was exactly the same as religion. The second candelabrum was represented the wheel of the people in the guise of Jupiter striking the aristocracy. So it was mostly because of these two statuettes that the judges wanted to convict Chinard. But the trial sort of became an international scandal, and it ended mostly thanks to the intervention, quite funnily and contradictorily, if you want, of a cardinal, the Cardinal de Bernis, who had been a long term of Madame de Pompadour, so Louis XV's mistress. And here you really see kind of the contradictions of Chinard, the revolutionary, saved by a cardinal. But anyway, he was saved. He was returned all of his possessions, which is also why we still have, amazingly, these works, these beautiful terracottas. And he fled. He had to flee Rome because he was banned from the Papal State. And he went back to France, where he was hailed as a revolutionary hero. But it didn't last long, because very soon his sculptures, the very same sculptures which had earned him a reputation as a revolutionary in Italy, were deemed not revolutionary enough by the French Jacobins under the Terror. And so he was convicted again because he was accused of betraying the revolutionary cause. So it's really a paradox. He went to prison twice for opposite reasons. In prison, he was allowed to work and made works such as these two statuettes. And here you see that there's a very strong stylistic transition from the one on the left to the one on the right. You see on the left is a gracious, windswept figure, which is also at the Carnavalet Museum in Paris. And on the right, there's a heroic, static, very rigid figure, which really tells us about a change in style that Chinard developed during his time in prison. And tellingly, the statue on the right also represents a strange iconography, a very difficult iconography, innocence in the shape of a dove, trying to take refuge in the bosom of justice. So during the time that Chinard spent in prison, he also took on a new habit, that of covering his statues and statuettes with inscriptions to clarify the meaning. And I mean, we can't really blame him, knowing what he went through for because of the meaning that was attached to his works without consulting him. So here you see inscriptions that clarify that this is the people of France, or liberty, and so on. But I think that, funny as this may be, it also tells us about a very crucial problem for artists of Chinard's generation, and that's that it must have been very, very difficult for them to come up with new iconographies, a new meaning, while also having to use old forms in a way, because they had to create objects that were appealing, visually appealing, for an audience that had trained their taste in pre-revolutionary times. So there is in a way always this tension in these decades between form and content, iconography and shape in a way, which is very, very important to acknowledge in a way. So very soon after being released from prison, Chinard understood that he had to rely on powerful people and take them to his side. So he sought the patronage of a very, very powerful and rich couple, the Récamier, who were also from Lyon. And here you see Juliette, Madame Récamier, who held one of the most celebrated salons in Paris and was known as a very, very beautiful woman, and so became a muse for many neoclassical artists, including Chinard. And it was somehow also thanks to Juliette that Chinard could aspire to the patronage of Napoleon himself. So in 1797, he actually was bold enough to write a letter to Napoleon asking him to make him useful to the cause. And Napoleon did so. And so he commissioned a number of busts from him. And I think that if we look at the Napoleon bust next to the bust of Étienne Vincent de Margnolas at the Frick, we really see how the Frick bust is inscribed in the celebration of the Napoleonic regime. And if you look at Margnolas' bust next to Napoleon, they really their faces look almost identical, as if Margnolas was kind of an alter ego of Napoleon. And if we look at another portrait of Margnolas by the Italian sculptor Giacomo Spalla, the bust on the right, which admittedly is very ugly, it sort of gives us a sense of more of an idea of what Margnolas may have looked like in real life. But what do we know about Margnolas other than the fact that maybe he wasn't as handsome as Chinard would have us think? Like Chinard, Margnolas was from Lyon, where he was born in 1781. And he had an extraordinarily quick career. In 1807, he was bestowed the newly established Légion d'honneur, which you see here pinned on his chest, with Napoleon's head in profile. And the next year, he became prefect of the Po region, which by and large corresponds to northern Italy, let's say. And remember, he was 27 years old. Less than 2 years later, in February 1809, he was appointed as a Councillor of State. And that was really a huge achievement because it meant that he was among the highest ranking dignitaries of the empire. And if we look at this comparison with the portrait by Jacques-Louis David of Comte Antoine Français de Nantes, which is at the Musée Jacques Marandré in Paris, we understand that we know that the Comte de Nantes portrait was in the sitter was wearing the clothes befitting the uniform of a Councillor of State. And that's exactly the same uniform that Margnolas is wearing. So this tells us that the portrait bust must have been made after February 1809, when Margnolas was appointed as a Councillor of State. But sadly, we also know that the portrait bust must have been made before October of that same year, because that's when Margnolas all of a sudden died of pneumonia at the age of 28. And in a way, knowing this, I always look at this portrait bust thinking that it is a great demonstration of the very strange relationship that exists between portraiture, and especially sculptural portraiture, and death, which is something many people have written on, but it's always fascinating and strange to realize how these two aspects are so closely and intimately connected. Anyway, we know that, let's go back to the story in a way of the bust. We know that in 1810, a bust of Margnolas by Chinard was exhibited at the Salon in Paris, and that's probably likely to be the Frick bust. And after the death of Étienne Vincent de Margnolas' son, the line of the Vincent de Margnolas family ended, and their possessions passed to Étienne's cousin and his family, the Vincent de Vaugelas. And here you see on the right an 1821 painting of the Vaugelas family with the terracotta bust by Chinard hanging on the wall, not really hanging, on a pedestal on the wall. And possibly this scene is set behind one of the windows of the Vaugelas chateau, the Chateau de Launay at Sainte-Foy, which is halfway in between Lyon and Dijon in southern France. And this, the Chateau de Launay, is where the bust came from when it was sold at auction in 1997. But before then, at some point, the bust had been covered in black paint to simulate a bronze bust. And this was really a practice which was so very common from the 17th, from around the 17th to around the 19th century, because wood and terracotta were thought to be very poor materials, not noble enough for sculpture. And since we are talking about different materials, it's really important to say that a few years ago, a marble version of this bust resurfaced on the market in Paris. And this bust was previously unknown, and some said that maybe this was the bust which was shown at the Salon in 1810. But as you can see, there's still bits of marble still attached to the stiff collar of the coat. So the bust is unfinished, and it's unlikely that it was shown like this at the Salon. But more important than that, we also know that Chinard was so successful also because he would make clay models for the busts of his sitters and then leave these busts with the sitters, allowing them with a contract to reproduce in different materials his terracotta busts as many times as they wanted, and in whichever material they pleased. So it's very hard to say if actually this is by Chinard himself or if it was made by someone else later on. Even if it came within the family, we also need to remember that what the family wanted, the Vaugelas family, a few years later in 1821, wanted to be portrayed with wasn't the marble version of the bust, but actually a terracotta version of it. So this really tells us about a different status of these two works. But also what makes the terracotta so special, I think, in relation to the marble, is that there is in this work a coexistence of a still idealized face with this amazing movement of the cloak, which almost seems to be on the verge of falling down, were it not for the rope, which is still holding it up. And there's also play between the very polished surface of the skin versus the encrusted small little details of the clothing. Look at the tassels, the rope, the lace, and also the oak leaves pattern on the cloak. And I think it's really these internal contradictions that are so beautifully expressed by this material that make this bust so beguiling and arresting. So after the bronze paint was removed, the Frick purchased the bust in 2004. And at that point, the Frick hadn't made any acquisitions for almost 10 years. So it really was kind of a sensation. And since 2004, the bust has stayed at the Frick in the East Gallery of 1 East 70th Street, the historic building of the Frick. But now you can see the terracotta bust by Chinard on the 4th floor of Frick Madison, in a room which is entirely dedicated to 19th century French works, with other portraits by Ingres, David, Gérard, all works that were not collected by Henry Clay Frick himself, strangely, because we know that probably he didn't like the French 19th century that much, while we know that he loved the 18th century. But he certainly did like portrait busts, like any other kind of portraiture. So I'm sure that he would be extremely pleased with the stunning acquisition of this Chinard bust. So do come and see it at Frick Madison as soon as possible. Thank you for joining us tonight, and see you soon for another episode. Goodbye.